Looks like people are coming in from all over the country.
Health, Portland. Portland, I'm so sorry about your war-torn conditions in your fair city. Um,
That's interesting, though. One of the things that jumps out about the moment we're in Portland, but also in Chicago, is that the official line is that they are taking undocumented immigrants, but it's pretty clear they're trying to cow white middle class voters to do what they say. So it's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely the case, right? I'm from the deep South, from Alabama, where there's, I think, a subspecialty among some people in intimidating voters. And so we sort of know it when we see it. And that's exactly what it looks like. My former paralegal from when I was a young lawyer in Washington is in Portland, Oregon now. And she sends me these great photographs of beautiful flower markets and the farmers market, and they're out having a good time drinking coffee downtown. I have not seen flames or any reason to have National Guards troops out there. And, a federal judge feels the same way, who knows a whole lot more. So it's, I think, as you say, just a very clear frontal attack on the elections.
So, listen, I know this is your Substack, but can I start by saying congratulations?
Thank you.
Although,
Thank you
is it
so
showing up
much.
backward? It's
No,
showing up
it
backwards.
looks fine. And, I would actually pick mine up too, but I can't because I have my phone precariously on top of mine so that my phone can be here.
But so I would love to take the opportunity to ask you some questions about it.
Sure, I
Kind of
have
to
some
flesh out
answers.
some of the stuff. Well, let's see. Um, so, one of the things that you talk about here has bothered me forever, and I have mentioned it to legal people before, and they're like, yeah, well, that's not quite right. So, can you walk me through the fact you talk about Marbury versus Madison, which is the 1803 decision in which the Supreme Court, under John Marshall,
Hmm.
sort of grabs the power to conduct judicial review. And that decision comes down in 1803. But one of the things that you mention in that strikes me as being so important is that essentially when the framers finished the Constitution, they wrote a whole bunch about what the Congress was supposed to do, and then a little bit less about what the president was supposed to do. And by the time they got to the judges, they were like, screw it, we're hungry. Let's just have some judges. So basically, our entire judicial system, or not entire, but the vast majority of it, comes from two congressional laws: the Judiciary Act of 1789 and the Judiciary Act of 1801, right?
That's absolutely right. And, the founders talked about it before they wrote the Constitution, but not nearly as much after, which has led to this prevailing thought that the Article 3 branch of the government is the least powerful branch. It is. The Supreme Court doesn't have armies to send out to enforce its decisions. And largely, the way that its enforcement mechanism works is because we have confidence in the integrity of the courts. That's why judges are so careful about not spilling their integrity unnecessarily. And we live in an interesting world today where, at least with regard to the Supreme Court, that's not always the case, right? I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between district court judges, trial judges, and courts of appeals who increasingly are getting shadow docketed by the Supreme Court, which, criticizes their decisions and expects them to follow law, even though the Supreme Court is no longer, in some of these really important cases involving presidential power, saying what the law is. They just have an anonymous, signed off decision. Maybe you get a paragraph, no explanation. And then the Supreme Court is indignant about lower court decisions that don't apply it properly, which is, I think, sort of where we are today. Your question, I think, is a super interesting one.
Well,
And yeah, go
can I
ahead.
get to what I really would love to hear you address?
Yeah.
And that's that if Congress created the Supreme Court created its own right of judicial review. And if
Hmm.
Congress created the courts, can't Congress take it back? Can't they take back the right of judicial review? And can't Congress take back the establishment of the Supreme Court as it currently is? Certainly it has expanded it and contracted it over the years. And the last time anybody revisited in a way that changed the court, the number of people on it, was in 1860 freaking 9.
Yeah.
So this idea that somehow these 9 unelected people get to have the final say on the lives of 341 million Americans at a time when they're really seeming to be political actors, to me opens up the idea that Congress, well, if it gets replaced, could say, "Now, just a minute here, let's revisit this." Is that nuts?
It's not nuts. I think it's a great question, and I think it's a fair point. I'll start by saying we don't know the answer for sure because it's never been tried before. But could Congress do something? It could. I mean, the current Congress, quite frankly, could try to do something that perhaps people who believe in the rule of law would not like. But a theoretical, democratically led Congress, and I'm saying democratically very intentionally as opposed to Democrat, because I think it would require bipartisan action, could think about right sizing the court in some really important ways. Where I started, this notion that the court depends on public's confidence in its integrity, that could be restored if Congress stepped in. You're talking about expanding the court. Initially I was hesitant on this, and I still am a little bit for a very pragmatic reason. Courts that get too big are very tough to deal with. The Ninth Circuit on the West Coast is a great example. The court is now so big that the judges struggle to read the decisions by every active judge on the court because there are so many of them, 30 plus. But the justices, 9 of them, that was originally configured to align with the number of federal circuits so that you would have one justice for every circuit. There's a really good argument that you should take the number up to 11, even to 13, because there are 2 specialty courts. 11 might work out okay. And if that was done in a rigorously apolitical way, and perhaps term limits were imposed at the same time that equalized who was appointing to the Supreme Court. That's complicated, right? Because it doesn't always go back and forth, the presidency. But a good faith effort could be made. And that might have 2 benefits, both restoring the court's integrity and making the process in the future less political. Can Congress do it? Donald Trump does a lot of things just by going out and doing it, right? I mean, he just went and took off the East Wing. I suspect Congress could go out and add a couple of justices and change rules about timing if it wanted to. And then it would so ironically be up to the court to pass on that, which is, I guess, a whole different kettle of fish.
Well, but so I'm actually asking not just about the expansion of the court, which I think obviously we can do because we've done it so many times before, but even taking on the issue of judicial review, as
Mm.
John Marshall set it up in 1803. I mean, he literally just took that power. And in fact, until pretty late in the 19th century, it was not clear that that was going to be the doctrine. And now we all just live with it. But what if we all just said, actually, the Constitution doesn't give you that right. You took that right, and we, as the Congress, are going to take it back.
So, it's an interesting question, right? When Marshall in Marbury versus Madison, and forgive me for being super nerdy, decides that the courts have a right of judicial review, which in essence, in that case, was to look over Congress's shoulder and decide whether or not Congress had acted in excess of the Constitution. Um, there's a response to a very difficult situation where the court is being asked to decide about whether these last-minute appointments at the end of a presidential administration were legitimate or not. And they sort of neatly sidestep the question by creating judicial review and saying, well, of course, there are enforceable rights here, but Congress, in the Judiciary Act, went beyond its constitutional authority when it gave us the ability to engage in certain kinds of writs which exceed the constitutional purview of the courts. So it gets caught up in that technical issue, but I think that the opinion is written in a very crafty fashion that sets up this problem. You want to know, could Congress go back and seize that right back? I suppose they could, just along the lines of destroying the East Wing. The problem is what would be left if they did that for the courts to do. There has to be some arbiter for these sorts of critical decisions, right? I mean, the problem that the founding fathers struggled with was, how do we keep the president from becoming a king? Because we're creating this government because we don't like kings. Or as I say in the book, I think king here is just a nice word for a dictator, and maybe we should abandon king and acknowledge that we're talking about dictators and autocrats. And so who can offset that balance? Well, Congress certainly can. The problem is that if Congress then is a powerful counterbalance without any check on it, you sort of could potentially have the same issue. And that's the creation of the courts, and the reason, frankly, we've tolerated them engaging in judicial review all of these years is that they take the most difficult cases, the ones that people cannot decide on their own. And until recently, and I would date this perhaps further back than reversing Roe versus Wade, but certainly reversing Roe versus Wade was a moment in American history. The court has exercised review with restraint and has not, for instance, just in this wholesale fashion, trashed precedent or come up with ridiculous doctrines like the currently in vogue major case doctrine that says in cases where the court doesn't really want to let Democrats win, we're going to say Congress wasn't specific enough. So, this court is problematic, Heather. I won't pretend that in my view it isn't, as much as that pains me. I think the notion of doing away with judicial review altogether would leave a real vacuum in American politics and the architecture of our system, and I fear what it would be filled by.
Okay, that's a good answer. I mean, that's a much more thorough answer than we don't want to go there, which I think is an invaluable thing to have out there. So, I uh, have a bunch of other questions. Let's see which one we want to go with. I'm going to go with um, the Supreme Court, as you identified just now, and actually as you identify in the book, is a real problem, in part because it had permitted Donald Trump to outrun the courts. But also you have a really interesting discussion of the unitary executive theory, which is a really radical fringe theory that is now mainstreamed. And you identify it in the book as an attempt to get rid of the regulatory state, that they come up with which is pretty clear, that they come up with the idea that the president is all powerful in order to get rid of the idea that the executive branch, the bodies within the executive branch, like the EPA created by Congress, have any say. But I was interested in that because to me, it looked like there were parallels between that and the creation of the Federalist Society in the early 1980s to say we want to get rid of what they called activist judges. And what's interesting about both of those things, that the people who are advancing those arguments, both of the unitary executive and of the Federalist Society, trying to get rid of what they called activist judges, is their solution to what they considered the overreach of Congress was essentially to create a dictator, which is an interesting problem in political theory, if you think about it, that if you get rid of the idea of the body of Congress, it seems somewhat inevitably to lead you back to a tyrant. Is that fair, do you think?
You know, let me answer it this way, but just through experience. So I went to law school at the University of Virginia around the time that the Federalist Society is really stepping onto the stage in a very real way. And for those of you who
So that's
aren't
like
lawyers,
84?
yeah, I graduated in 85, and by
Okay.
83, 84, we're hearing speakers and seeing formation of the group, and I have really close friends who are involved in it. And, I'll just tell you as an aside, in Birmingham, as a lawyer, I used to go to Federalist Society meetings not because I liked their views, they knew exactly who I was, but because they would get great speakers who would talk about important and interesting legal ways. And I've always been a huge fan of sort of sleeping with the enemy and understanding what their arguments are so that you can test your own views and counter their arguments based on the best people that are making them. So I found that to be an interesting exercise. These are people who said that they believed in states' rights and were pushing back against an executive branch of government with administrative agencies that they characterized as a nanny state, that they believed were intruding into the provenance of the states. And in many ways, I think they're now sort of like the dog that catches the car. They never thought that their arguments would go this far. They didn't think that Congress, for instance, would roll over and permit the creation of an increasingly powerful president. I mean, they put these folks, 6 of them, on the Supreme Court, and certainly, I think, if not all six, pretty close to it, ascribed to some form of the unitary executive theory, this idea that the president is way more powerful than he has become in modern history. And for instance, can fire anyone in the executive branch, any employee at will for no reason whatsoever, can create a doge that can slash federal agencies, all this stuff that we're in the process of living through. I just don't think that they thought that they could go this far. I don't know what they say in private, Heather, but I suspect some of them believe that they have gone too far in creating too powerful of a president, if for no other reason than, God willing, and we actually have elections in 2028, that worm could turn and they could find themselves with a very powerful Democratic president on their hands.
Well, so the reason I'm interested in that particular line of questioning is exactly what you identify. An awful lot of it comes from the idea of states' rights and the concept of originalism picking up on states' rights. And the more I think about the origin of states' rights in the 1830s, really is when it takes off as a political argument
Hmm.
under Andrew Jackson. I wonder if all along it has essentially been, let's get rid of democracy. Because it doesn't make any sense that you're so concerned about the rise of a strong government that you create a dictator. It doesn't make any logical sense.
Yeah, I mean, I hear your point. I don't have special insight into their views. I think as a proposition, this idea that people who wanted to reserve rights to their state, to their governor, to keep it closer to home so that they could have more influence over
I was going to say
the
to
laws that they lived
themselves,
under, right? To themselves.
right?
And I think what they feared was this idea of a centralized authority in Washington that could dictate to them. And we all saw how that played out during the civil rights era and understand exactly what that pushback from states in the Deep South was about. I'm not sure, and I would love to be a historian and go back and look at textual sources and figure out just how far they thought that would go, because I think you raise a pretty interesting point.
Well, I find that whole argument fascinating, not just in terms of the United States, but in terms sort of logic and governance. Is this really an accident that they have created a dictator, or was that essentially the plan all along to create what is basically minority rule? And minority rule eventually always devolves into the idea of one person being better than others. I don't know. I think it's an
Well,
interesting question.
I would just say that's the entire point of gerrymandering, right? Preserving
Yeah.
minority rule. And decades ago, when it became apparent, the thinking early on was that around 2050, there would be a demographic shift in this country that would make it tough for Republicans to ever elect a president again. And so they seized on this idea of holding on to the House as opposed to trying to expand their base and appeal to a new generation of voters. And although I think that analysis seems to have just been very off kilter, that is inherently anti-democratic, the notion of gerrymandering and legitimizing political gerrymandering and injecting dark money into our politics, which is what they've fought so hard for on the courts.
So this actually ties right into the next question I had. You talk in this book around page 117 about voter fraud. And one of the things that a distinction I think is really valuable that I bet you can tell us a lot about is the difference between voter fraud, which is vanishingly rare, and election fraud, which is much greater and part of America's DNA.
Yeah. So, traditionally, how voting rights lawyers think about this distinction is voter suppression versus voter fraud. Voter fraud is the idea that people who aren't entitled to vote wrongly vote in elections and have their ballots counted and influence the outcome of elections. And I am just here to tell you that doesn't happen. My friend Justin Levitt, a law professor who has studied this extensively and looked at decades of data, I think found just one or two elections, runoff elections for city councils, very small numbers of votes, where there was even the potential to do that. But the reality is voter fraud gets uncovered because there are so many checks in our system and it gets prosecuted on just that handful of occasions where it's happened. Doesn't happen in national elections, can't happen in major elections. And also, let me just say this out loud. people who are in the United States who are not citizens are not registering and voting in humongous numbers and stealing elections from Donald Trump or anybody else. That's just not the case. The real problem is voter suppression. That's the real issue.
Election
People
fraud.
Election fraud is, I think, has become the more modern term, right? Keeping people who are entitled to vote from voting. Let me tell you what that used to look like in Alabama. So, my husband ran an ill-fated campaign against Roy Moore, a name some of you will remember, for Chief Justice in Alabama. Roy Moore is the guy who ultimately lost to Doug Jones in the Alabama Senate race when some very unsavory dating practices involving younger women came to light.
Come
But
on.
Bob,
Unsavory dating practices. Boy, that is legalese. Look him
girl,
up,
I'm a
folks.
Southerner. What are you expecting? But Bob ran against Roy Moore before that came to light. It was despite that fact, it was a shockingly close race. I mean, Alabama history, that was the race that made it possible for Doug to raise money because Bob came close enough that it was clear we were legitimate. So in that race, these are the mailers that go out in Alabama communities. It's like a really ugly picture of Bob with President Obama over his head holding puppet strings, like Bob is a marionette for President Obama, who he had never met. There is an email that went out to church groups that said that Bob was married to a woman who advocated for Sharia law in Alabama because I worked with Muslim communities in my district to protect their civil rights. So it was all that kind of nonsense, right? And it goes from that little laughable stuff to these big systemic efforts that we see, laws that are passed that make it more difficult for people to vote. Right now, the poster child is the SAVE Act that would make Americans prove that they are American citizens before they can register or re-register. And that is nothing other than a poll tax. It would force people to spend money to obtain proof of citizenship. For a lot of people, that would price them out of voting. So this is the real problem in our elections. And I think the good news is this is something that we can all play a role in fighting back against.
Well, so speaking of which, this is on the main ballot in next month, I forget how many days from now, and the estimate for the proposition that is going before Maine voters is that it will significantly cut down absentee voting, which is how 40% of people in Maine actually vote. And that's obviously being pushed by the radical right, which is trying to get rid of, up to 40% of the voters in Maine, which is really shocking. So you talk in this book, and I think the whole point of this book was how to fight back against this. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? And then I have some observations about where we might be with that.
Um, that sounds good because, I wrote this book in January, February, a little bit into March. And I write in the book that early on I was just tearing stuff up. I would write it and then I would tear it up because it was out of date, because Trump was spewing crap out through the fire hose at just this incredible velocity, much more competent and organized than in the first administration, very aligned with what people who had studied Project 2025 expected, but I think not all at once. I mean, I thought we would see a lot of this, but the way that they did it was very, very off-putting. And so early on, there's so much going on that it becomes very difficult to get your arms around the entirety of it. And I think that was sort of our deer in the headlights moment in America, where a lot of people just stopped in shock and weren't really entirely sure what to do next, right? So I had the challenge of writing this book, not knowing where we were going to be 6 months later, which I guess is always the challenge for authors. Here it felt especially acute. And ironically, I think to the extent that I erred, although I'm very pleased with how the book held up, I think I didn't fully realize how fast Trump would go. For instance, I speculated about the possibility that he would violate court orders and would do it openly and flagrantly. I don't know that I expected that we would be worrying about that as early in this presidency as we did, right? And so I think for me, what that suggests is that the biggest challenge that Americans face in this moment is pretty simple to define. It's staying informed. It's not being overwhelmed by this constant onslaught of stuff, which is consistent with this Steve Bannon view of flood the zone, make it impossible for people to keep up. And we know from the work of experts in authoritarianism, like my friend Ruth Ben-Ghiat, that this is like, 101 for dictators, right? Get people so overwhelmed that they will simply give up. And then you can just roll all over them. So to me, it felt like the primary challenge was telling people, don't do that. Don't let them have their way with you. Make sure that you stay engaged. And that's going to look different for everybody. And that's okay. One of the most important things that I've learned studying democracy is that everyone wants to engage with it differently. I had a law student a couple years ago who wrote a phenomenal paper on using art to sustain democracy. And I think, that's important. I mean, we're both knitters. Knitters are legend when it comes to supporting democracy, whether it was the pink pussy hats in 2016, whether it's the slogan sweaters and hats that are being knit now. We should never underestimate these sort of gentle seeds that people plant to support democracy. And I know I'm sort of talking all around this, but I had a friend write over the weekend, and she said, I read your book. Thank you. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only crazy person out there that sees problems. And it's good to know that it's not just me. And other people think that we're at a potentially devastating moment in American history, and we all need to band together and do something about it before it's too late. And that's very much where I am. So I'm fascinated. I'd love to hear your
Well,
observations.
so one of the things that you talk about, though, is the replication of democracy in our personal lives.
Hmm.
And and how that enables people to understand what democracy looks like. And I don't know if you know the recent book by Dylan Penningroth called Before the Movement, about the ways in which Black Americans engaged with the legal system and with the courts long before civil rights in order to enforce their deeds, their marriages. Basically, they were very much involved in the system. And he talked about how that worked, along with how the actual ways in which the Black church worked in terms of democracy meant that when a moment came where it was possible to make democratic demands, they knew what to do. And, you've heard that a lot from people: join something, be part of an organization, and so on. And it really is interesting to me now that the Trump administration has said it will not use the $6 billion it has in reserve to fund SNAP in November. They need about $8 billion. There's $6 billion in reserve for that purpose. And House Speaker Mike Johnson was out in front of the cameras today saying, no, we can't do that. That's illegal, which is completely contrary to what they said a month
I
ago.
guess it's legal to build a golden ballroom, but you can't feed people.
Yeah, well, that ballroom hasn't been built yet. I'm holding my breath on that one. We'll see where all that money
Hmm.
goes. But what I have seen on social media and in my town is people organizing to help each other. The many, the 42 million Americans who depend on SNAP, because the food banks are not going to be able to do it in the current state that they're currently in, and probably not probably, and not fully anyway. But to me, this looks like the kind of cooperation that we saw during the Depression that led to the New Deal. What do you think of that?
So I had a conversation last night with friends over dinner, some of whom are involved in infrastructure that gets food to people. And one of them made what I thought was the most important comment in this area. It's not a supply problem getting food to hungry people. It's a distribution problem. And I think at least what I'm seeing at home in Alabama, where the food banks in central Alabama, where the food bank is already stressed, desperate for more donations. So if you live in Alabama and you're able to, that's a great place to channel either your time or your money. Um, they really desperately need communities to come together. And it may be an irony that in some of these communities of Trump voters, right, people who voted for Trump the most will be hit the most by the end of
Yeah.
SNAP in some parts of the country. And they will expect communities built out of people like you and me to come together in their aid. There's so much irony wrapped up in that. But I do think that that's what we're going to see, because Americans are basically good, decent people, which makes me question how we've ended up in this moment where folks who go to church are okay with seeing, moms, hardworking moms, zip tied on their streets by masked agents. We live in this moment of so much just contradiction. And I mean, not just not just hypocrisy, but foundational conflict of values. I wonder if there's not a moment where that just explodes and people can't tolerate it anymore. I guess that's the Pollyanna in me still hoping that the fever dream will break at some point. Watching American kids starve because this administration will gild a ballroom, but it won't release money for SNAP. If that's not an American moment, then I think we're in deep, very deep trouble, deeper than we are now.
Well, it's funny you say that because, as I was coming over here, I thought, I'm really pissed off that my tax dollars went to Argentina rather than to starving children. And I'm like, "That's my money," and which is kind of where we started
Exactly.
this whole experiment, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's utterly insane. And, farmers in the Midwest who were being hurt by those foreign expenditures and who were largely Trump voters, seems like they ought to be pretty torqued about it too. I mean, where's the outrage, right? Why are people afraid to speak out against this president? Why aren't there elected representatives who are powerful people coming to the forefront, going to the White House and insisting that they back off and support their constituents, not people in a foreign country who support Trump? It's mishugas. It's just terrible.
Just to be clear, the Democratic representatives are doing that. It's the Republicans who are handing over all their power.
Exactly. I mean, it's like my friend Dahlia Lithwick, who many of you love because she's, I think, the best Supreme Court analyst out there, talks about a supine Congress. And to me, that's the image. The Republicans are just rolling over on their bellies and telling Trump, do whatever you want to do. And at the same time, we see Democrats who are engaging in what I think of as bravery. I know many people have been critical for them not doing enough. But we are watching, Adam Schiff come under the threat of prosecution. He appears to be next on Donald Trump's revenge prosecution list. His crime being an advocate for democracy, asking the president and his Republican colleagues in the Senate and in the House to do their jobs. I mean, apparently that's a crime in today's America for members of Congress to ask the institution to stand up and fulfill its constitutional obligation.
Well, like you say, we're in a moment. But I know you actually don't have a ton of time this afternoon, so I will let you go. But since you don't have the book, there you go. I did it
The
backwards.
coolest thing about it is it's right. When my publisher did it, the cover is embossed so
Yes,
that
it
like
is.
when you feel down it, you can feel the letters. It's pretty cool. I guess I like have that silly reaction most first authors do to seeing their own book in public, but it's very cool. It's
Well,
called Giving Up is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping a democracy. Thank you for the question, Monica V.
and thank you for letting me talk to you about it. I have
Yeah.
lots more questions, so we're gonna have to do it again soon. Maybe next time we'll bring our knitting again.
Anytime you want, I'll come up to your house and we can do it up there.
Well, except I have crappy, internet, so we have to come to
Okay,
yours.
you come to mine. It's
All right.
it's a date. Thank you all for
All
being
right.
with us.
Thanks, Joyce. That was fun.